how do you ensure that you really start to strike those iron clubs better than you currently do? And when we're talking about strike, really it's looking at just where the club makes contact with the ground relative to the ball. All of the best ball strikers will hit the ground after the golf ball. That's why we see huge divots when we watch the best players play golf on TV. And that's what I call a non-negotiable. You're not going to find anyone out there playing the world tours who doesn't do that. No one hits the ground before the ball, or no one's inconsistent in where they hit the ground. They all hit the ground consistently after the golf ball. Now, if we want you to do the same, we want to elevate your ball striking, we need to look at what influences that. What can we do in the golf swing, and specifically in this video, the body and the hips? What can we do in those areas that help that happen more often? And we're going to be specifically looking at 2 movements in the hips, which I think you need to work on and you need to practice to help you strike the ball better. And that's what we're going to do. Now, if you want a little bit more of an in-depth training course on how to strike the ball better, there's a training course on my website right now. You can click the link below or the one in the corner. It'll take you over to there. I'd love you to check it out. So let's get started with the first movement that's going to help you strike your irons better. Now for this one, we're going to use a slightly different camera angle, one that we don't often use, but it's over here. So as I set up to the golf ball, it's going to be looking at me from behind. Now, obviously you're not going to be able to see your golf swing from there, so it may well be using a camera, using a reflection, or even just the information in this video might change the way you think a little bit about what you do within your hips. So for this first little exercise, we're really going to be using 2 reference points. So we're going to be looking at the trail hip, which is my right hip, and we're also looking at the tailbone, so the middle of the hips, which we can see referenced there. Now, what great ball strikers do is as they are transitioning from backswing to downswing, so we'll call that the sort of transition of the golf swing, the tailbone will actually be closer to the target than it was at setup. So let me show you what that would look like. I want you to keep your eye on my tailbone, and we'll put a little line on there to make it a little bit easier to visualize. When I get to the end of my backswing, that tailbone has moved closer to the target. Now, how it does that is different for many golfers. You look at someone like Rory McIlroy, he will actually start his golf swing with a little bit of a bump of his hips away from the target, but then he still, at the completion of his backswing, has his tailbone slightly closer to the target than it was at the top of the backswing. If you struggle with ball striking, you don't hit the ground after the ball, you hit it fat, you hit it thin, striking is just not a strong point for you, might not be what you see. You might well be seeing that tailbone sort of shifting laterally away from the target, and you can see how that looks very different to the one that we just demonstrated a moment ago. If that is you, you're just going to find it very difficult to get back onto your lead side. If you can't get back onto your lead side, we very simply can't hit the ground over here. We're always going to hit in the ground target side of the ball. So there's 2 ways you can think about this really. You can simply think about your tailbone and having that actually moving towards the target in your backswing. Or you may want to think about just creating a little bit of a gap between your trail hip and a reference point at the start. So if I put a line on my trail hip, you will see that there is a slight gap created between that starting position and where I was at the top. Now, there is a little side note to this, a little caveat. Watch what happens if I demonstrate what we'd often see as a great hip move into a good player. We'll often see, I've got my club here, it's easy to see, a little bit of a bump across to the trail side. What that does, it shifts pressure. And then as they start to rotate, that's when the hips start to make the movement that we're talking about in this video. What I really wouldn't want you to do is start your golf swing and have the hips making this move far too early. Yes, that gets the weight onto that lead side, but it doesn't really work on, well, it's not great for timing and tempo. The sequencing isn't as good as it could be. So it's not just simply a case of saying, okay, from setup, I've got to move my hips forwards. It's probably not going to get it done. We still want some nice early pressure shift into that trail side, but then we can have the hips working into this position. So let me show you that again from that behind the camera viewpoint. Take an address. Okay to have a little bit of lateral shift early on, but then we start to work the hips back into this position. That is going to give you a superb top of the backswing position with your hips. It's going to make it much more likely to strike the ball better. But this second move is going to really help that and get you absolutely flushing those irons. So for this second point, we need to reference the hips, and you can see that I've done that just through an alignment stick, which has just gone pretty simply through my belt line. And what we're really using this for is to see the levels of the hip, so which hip is higher. As I stand fairly naturally, with any luck, my hips are fairly level, but obviously I could make this hip higher, I could make this hip lower, I can change the levels, and the levels will change and should change in your golf swing. Now, if we take that perfect backswing that you've just made now, where the hips have worked fantastically well and the tailbone has gone a little bit towards the target, what you're also going to find when you do that is that the lead hip, which is my left hip, will end up being slightly lower than the trail hip, and you can see that there. Now, what happens at impact is, if I simulate impact, you can see that relationship has changed over. You can see how the lead hip is now higher than the trail hip. So there's a change from top of the backswing, lead hip lower, impact, lead hip higher. Fine. How do we get there? This is the key move. The golfers out there who struggle, if you are in that category, this is probably what you're doing, will get the lead hip higher far too soon. So they may well make this great backswing, but the first move, the lead hip just goes forward and up. What it actually does is the lead hip goes up, it forces the lead shoulder up. And if the lead shoulder goes up, it forces the head up and back. And when the head is going up and back, it just makes sense that we can't hit the ground target side of the golf ball. What you have to remember is, if you see your head moving in the golf swing, it's not your head moving, it's your upper body doing things that we don't want it to do, and that gives you the visual that your head is moving. So as soon as that lead hip gets bumped up and forwards, we very often get everything else being thrown back and up. Then we start to hit the ground early, then we start to really struggle with ball striking. What the best players are doing in transition and as they start down is that they're moving their hips towards the target. So there's a lateral element, lateral component, but the lead hip is staying lower than the trail hip for a much, much longer period of time. When the lead hip starts to go upwards, it's because they are, or we are, pushing from the ground. Now, when do we want to push from the ground? Well, we really want to be pushing from the ground through impact. We don't really want to be pushing far too early, because what that does, it throws you back, as we've explained, but it also causes you to throw the club and early release it. So if you start to push too soon, you start to throw the club away, nothing good happens from there. You're not going to generate power, you're not going to generate speed, you're not going to generate distance, and the strike's going to be poor. So this would be the great little exercise. Use an alignment stick up to the top and transition, and see if you can get your hands roughly over your trail thigh with your hips level. Now you can see this one is probably, well, they're about level, maybe this one is fractionally lower, but that's what I'm looking for. I feel pressure in that lead side now. I feel like there's more weight under my left leg. I can use that to then push me up into that delivery position, but look where I'm able to strike the ground. I'm able to strike the ground after the golf ball, which is exactly what I want. Now, putting those two movements together, here's a little test that you can do. I'm going to take my setup to the golf ball, but just inside the ball. And watch what happens if I move the club towards the target. It just moves up and away from the ground instantly. Watch what happens if I can make a good backswing. I can make that nice transition. I can work my hands down to here with those checkpoints. I can then work to impact. Watch what I can do now. I'm able to scrape the club along the ground all the way to my lead foot, and then it will leave the ground. That simple little drill, that simple little exercise kind of shows me that what I did with my hips enabled me to achieve an impact position where I was able to strike the ground after the ball. And remember what we said right back at the start, it's a non-negotiable. You have to do that if you want to strike irons well. So if we put those things together, I'm going to do this in a fairly slow swing. We should be able to get the ball right at the centre of the golf club with a solid strike. Good hip backswing, keep it low from there, and then we go through. Now that ball's carried 40, 50 yards, but I can see where I struck the ground. There was a divot there. It was ball, it was turf, it felt super solid. It felt great at the club, there was compression there. The ball flight was great, it went straight. Everything that I needed that ball to do, it did. And that gives me the confidence and the information that that little exercise, little drill was perfect. Okay, so the next stage would be to add a little bit of speed to that. But those two movements are what I see in the best players. It's what's demonstrated in the best players in the world. If you can start to make those movements in your golf swing, I'd almost guarantee that you're going to start to see the strike getting better, and you're probably going to find a little bit more distance there as well. So thanks for watching. Really hope you enjoyed that, and hopefully we'll see you back here again soon for another video.